Hello, everyone, and welcome to This Week in Global Development. I'm Anna Gawel, Managing Editor of Devex, filling in for Raj Kumar today. I'm pleased to be joined by my colleagues, Global Development Reporter Elissa Miolene. Hi, Elissa.
Hey Anna, how are you?
I'm good. I'm good. And we've also got Business Editor Dave Ainsworth. Hi there, Dave.
Hey, how you doing?
So in today's episode, we're going to be doing something a little different, which is we're just going to be talking about our favorite moments from Devex World, which for those who don't know is our flagship event that we held at Studio Theater in Washington, D.C. last week on the sidelines of the World Bank IMF annual meetings. And I do want to start that I actually hate saying the word sidelines because it's as if we were relegated to them or something like that, when in fact we drew a ton of people from the bank who braved DC traffic to come across town and join us, including the World Bank's number two, Axel von Trotzenberg, and other officials. And I think our appeal was we had more than finance types. We had filmmakers, historians, obviously NGO leaders, former government officials, experts in health and foreign aid. So it's a really diverse group. We also had kind of an elusive, I would say, but big time philanthropist, not Bill Gates, but Howard Buffett, who is the son of billionaire Warren Buffett. And so I was going to kick it off with that because his session was actually one of my favorite moments of the day. This is a guy whose foundation gives away like $500 million a year and has all of 22 employees. He's just really this regular, unassuming guy. He's very eclectic. He's, photographer, author, conservationist, farmer, even a one-time county sheriff. So he's got a really eclectic background. And he's a really avid supporter of Ukraine, which took up the bulk of our kind of the 50-minute conversation that we had with him. He was adamant that if we don't do more to help Ukraine, it could snowball into World War III. Uh, of course, you could kind of debate that because there's plenty of other people who say if we support Ukraine too much, that will trigger Russia and that could trigger World War III. But I think his passion, in my opinion, was pretty commendable. He sailed through geopolitics. He said, North Korea, Russia, and Iran are out to quote unquote destroy the U.S. He's visited Ukraine. He shot photos, wrote a compelling book about it. He's really frustrated by the lack of urgency and attention that he thinks that the war gets. And kind of he claims, the U.S. has no strategy. And the part that really stuck out for me was when he said, right now, what we're doing is standing with Ukraine long enough for them to fight and die. So I thought those were pretty powerful words. And I thought, in general, his kind of the session was pretty powerful also in this, and I'll end on this point, is when he described kind of his epiphany in his philanthropic career, which is he used to photograph wildlife, fund conservation efforts. He still may, I don't know. But at some point, someone told him that no one is going to starve to save a tree. And that also really, struck a chord. I think he said his that really shifted his mindset and expanded his focus to encompass more the human element of philanthropy. And I just thought it was really, interesting the way that he framed it. And it was kind of provocative. Do we do nature, humans first, and this kind of debate in philanthropy? So anyway, I won't go down a rabbit hole, but I thought that was pretty fascinating. I don't know if you guys have any thoughts on Buffett or other moments that stuck out for you.
Um, I was pretty struck by that line as well, and there were a lot of interesting philanthropists there at the event. And this is always kind of a challenge with philanthropy, and this came up several times. I was mostly interviewing people in our pro lounge. I had a chance to chat to a lot of speakers one on one, and they talked a lot about doing good well, and the this was one of Buffett's themes was you need to look after people. If you want to look after nature, you need to look after the people who are going to cut things down. Like, you can't expect people to get on board with your conservation efforts if they are hungry, which is obviously true. And we heard a lot of people talk about basically how the problem is that we're going around, running around trying to save the world, but we're not doing it very efficiently, very effectively. This was something a lot of my interviewees focused on. And so that line was obviously powerful. I think we can all agree on Ukraine as well, that we're kind of the European and American efforts to support Ukraine have become a little half-hearted. This is kind of a geopolitical thing rather than a development thing necessarily, um, because it's not really the business of development whether we get involved in Ukraine to the extent that we support the Ukrainians to actually win this war. But I think we can talk about the fact that the development efforts to support Ukraine and all efforts to support Ukraine started out really enthusiastic and gung ho, and then, and again, this is another common theme in development, I think, with disasters, with wars, with whatever it is. You start out really enthusiastic. 6 months later, you're like, are you still hungry? Everybody loses interest, and we all move on to the next crisis. And we never really resolve anything because all of our efforts are front loaded. We start off helping people with huge enthusiasm, and then we're like, oh, this earthquake has become really dull, or whatever it is. And we move on to the next thing. And I think Buffett kind of highlighted that this is essentially the trap that we, even with Ukraine, which governments were initially incredibly enthusiastic about, everybody's now losing interest. And
Yeah,
we've
and I think it goes, you mentioned geopolitics. I think it goes to donor fatigue, but it also goes to global attention, the bandwidth people have. So I thought it was good that he brought up Ukraine and really got into, the historical analogies and all of that. Elissa, what about you? What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think I was really lucky at Devex World. Kind of colleagues and I joked that I was on the art beat for the day, which was fantastic for someone who loves reading and other kind of things like that as much as I do. I was able to talk to people actually directly about this issue, enthusiasm, how to capture attention, how to make people care, through two panels, one on fiction and one on film and storytelling. So those conversations were really, really interesting because we really got into, okay, how do we get people to care and also to do it in a way that's authentic, but also respectful to the communities that INGOs and NGOs and nonprofits work with. And it just raised a lot of kind of, I think, interesting questions about like, is there more that we can do on the narrative sector or the narrative kind of angle to drive these types of things home? And I think that especially with all the competing interests, number of crises exploding, the number of disasters, this is becoming ever more important. I think the conversation about fiction in particular was interesting because I think one of the panelists described novels as kind of the most immersive technology or the first immersive technology that humans really created in terms of really getting someone in the space where they can understand this is what it feels like to be a refugee, or this is what it feels like to be a migrant, or this is what it feels like to be in the wake of a natural disaster. So just kind of food for thought in terms of like, how do we turn the tide? How do we get folks to care, especially those who might not be in our sector, in our orbit, and thinking about these issues all the time?
So
Yeah.
this was something that I found really interesting. Now, maybe it's no coincidence that we sit here, three journalists saying, well, the stuff about narrative was the most interesting thing of the day. But to me, it was, for
Mhm.
absolute sure. Like, I would pick out the guy that I interviewed, rather selfishly, Rutger Bregman, as particularly fascinating. A guy who's kind of given up what he was doing previously and has suddenly launched this new project to go out and find people who are working in what he called bullshit jobs, finance, management consultancy, law,
You were
things like
dying to get that in, weren't you?
that. Absolutely was.
You succeeded.
Well, I was interested actually in how Bregman is sitting on stages where people never swear and decides that he has the freedom and the license to start firing out some pretty light profanity, and how it actually gets the attention from everybody. People are sitting there, they're bored, they're checking their phones, they're like, oh, this weird Dutch guy is swearing. And suddenly everybody's interested, and that's his most famous quote, isn't it? Taxes, 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 all the rest is bullshit. So clearly, maybe he sits on something. And Bregman was a fantastic communicator. And this was the thing that really came through to me was that he was so much better at communicating the same message that everybody else wanted to say. It wasn't that anybody in development was like, oh, this guy's a genius. None of us had thought of this. this is a really clever idea. Like, it's that he was saying something so simply, so succinctly, so like accessibly that he was getting cut through with an audience of people who otherwise were not interested. And I'm going to jump for a second onto a personal bugbear here, which is that I think the development sector is terrible at communicating development to people who are not development professionals. Like, it's a real 0 out of 10 skill set. Some of the language seems actively designed to repel people who might want to give development organizations money. Just dressing up highly emotive causes in the most technocratic, technical language, using words that nobody understands, deliberately stepping away from just calling a spade a spade. Like, we don't talk about poor people anymore. We don't talk about hungry people. We don't talk about people who need help. We don't talk about fairness. We don't talk about justice. All of these are words that instinctively resonate with the population of the planet, that people think like they want to identify themselves as fair, as just, as kind, as the type of person who would help someone who was hungry. But we never use those words. We're dressing it all up in
We
50
use
syllables.
a whole lot of jargon, LMICs, and I think, I mean, you hit on a great point. This was a running theme throughout the day through with several speakers where, not just Buffett, but another one was David Beasley. He's a good example. He is the former executive director of World Food Program. He's a Republican. And you know what? He's an unabashed fundraiser. I mean, he was prolific for WFP during his 6-year term. And he is really good at talking to people on both sides of the aisle, especially aid skeptics. And I think he does this because he speaks plainly, none of this jargon. He relates to people and he makes a practical, cost effective case for foreign aid. I think the example he used at Devex World was, we can put in really high costs to shelter children who have sought asylum in the US versus a hunger program back in Central America where they would migrate from. And the difference in cost is so stark. And I think like this is what resonates, and we need this kind of practical, bipartisan, in a sense, cheerleader more than ever. And again, he is able to tell that story. Gail Smith, former USAID administrator. I mean, she was so blunt. And one of her quotes was, "We're so excited to be in the room that I think we risk apologizing for being at the table." Development downplays, diminishes its power, its worth, and it doesn't communicate it very clearly. Bregman made that point. We should spend some money in terms of communicating, of establishing a brand. Again, Beasley made this point. Gail Smith made this point that, development is, albeit imperfect, a force for good and a possible antidote to a lot of the chaos that's going on in the world today. But a lot of people don't get that, and it does have a messaging problem. There's people don't want to be associated as like salesmen, but sometimes you have to make a good sales pitch. I don't know. That's kind of my thinking. Elissa, what are you're nodding, so I'm going to assume you've got some thoughts on this as well.
I mean, I was going to bring up Gail too, Anna, and I
Mhm.
think, she almost took all of this, as you started to mention, one step further, which is not just that we're not communicating about the good, but we're not communicating about the strategic value of this. And obviously, this is no new news. We know this. Development at its core is an incredibly powerful tool, for countries. We see it all over the world, the US, with China, with everyone. And yet, as she mentioned, we're so excited to be in the room that we risk, or we're so grateful to be there that perhaps we're underselling the power of development, right? And I think that's really important, especially as we're looking at an election. We did have a panel where one of our colleagues, Michael Igo, talked to a number of different folks on both sides of the aisle who had been both in, with the Trump administration last time around and who were close to Harris and other Democratic administrations. And I think that you could see the ways in which foreign aid priorities were bubbling up and were being important and looked at as important. But can we communicate that? So lots of important things I think to think through there in terms of how do we ensure that foreign aid and foreign assistance stays on the table and stays as a high priority on the table, and not downplaying it, right? And not apologizing for being there.
Yeah, completely. You reminded me of I think, quite a famous quote when an American general was asked about what would happen if we cut development funding, and he said, "We're going to have to buy some more bullets then." Um, but this kind of common ground theme was another one that kind of came through. You talked briefly about trying to communicate with people on both sides of the aisle. Um, it was very interesting to hear Republican aid experts stand on the stage and speak. And actually, they spoke, I thought, with a lot of clarity. I didn't agree with them, but or I actually I did agree with some bits and pieces of what they had to say. There were a lot of their tenets that I didn't fundamentally agree with, but I think you have to hand it to someone like Max Premack, who was on the panel with Michael. He knew what he wanted and he communicated it in extremely clear ways. I think, if I'm honest, the Democratic panelists who went up against him were again far more technocratic. There was a lot of verbiage there. I couldn't clearly understand, not knowing very much about those individuals, quite what they stood for. Premack came away, I understood exactly what he stood for. And he made a compelling argument. We don't want to waste money on this. We need to protect America. When he said I was pro-localization, and I'm pro-localization because it's cheap. The local organizations have better value for money. And that's why I want to give them the cash. So, okay, I get it.
Yeah.
I understand.
So, no, I don't mean to cut you off. Was just going to say, for those who don't know, Max Premack is one of the co-authors of the infamous Project 2025 playbook, which now former President Donald Trump likens it kind of to kryptonite, but it still could serve as a blueprint for a Trump administration. And he co-authored or authored entire section on USAID. And I thought that was really striking as well. I didn't agree with everything he said. I think the audience was quiet, and, an audience of development professionals are coming in very skeptical to what he said. But, when it came to localization, I mean, he was talking about, like, not necessarily how the USAID budget before COVID was about half, that's according to him. And that, we've plowed in so much money into USAID, but the outcomes are no different. Poverty is worse and so forth. Now, of course, you could argue it's not like USAID has the power to solve poverty on its own after, global phenomena like COVID. So I think that exaggerates USAID's power and does not necessarily mean it doesn't deserve the budget that it gets. But I thought it was really striking when he talked about localization. He's like, it's cheaper. If we cut the USAID budget, it would force them to shift power to local organizations. Now, whether that's true or not, I don't think you're getting rid of the big international INGOs. But like you said, he did make a clear, compelling point. Whereas the other side talked a lot about multilateralism and alliances, which is music to the ears of development professionals, because obviously that's really important, and less threatening than massive budget cuts. And to many people, more appropriate, like what we should be doing in foreign policy. But yeah, I like the way that you framed it. That one, you walked away with provocative thoughts, at least.
Yeah, and you came away with some clear talking points. Like, you understood what the man stood for, whether or not you agreed with him. And I think that is really where aid lets itself down a lot. We focus too much on being inclusive, on ensuring that we use language that means something that isn't insulting to anybody else. These are important things, but you cannot fail to be understood, because then it doesn't matter how polite and inclusive you've been. If nobody understood what you said, your message is wasted. Elissa, you spent a long time talking to Shamil Idris, right? He was
that was exactly who I wanted to bring up next. So Shamil, for those who don't know him, is the head of Search for Common Ground, which is a peace building organization. And he did speak on the Devex stage, but I was able to snag him for a bit more time for a one-on-one interview earlier in the day, and talk about different sides of the aisle and different opinions, Shamil in Search for Common Ground takes this to a whole new kind of level and brings it down to the community piece. So what the organization does is they work to bring folks from different sides of conflict, politics, whatever have you, and bring them together over different shared tasks or even soccer games. So he gave the example of, for example, Pennsylvania, there you have a big program doing work with Republicans and Democrats. And for those who don't know, Pennsylvania is a big swing state. So lots of divisions there in terms of our upcoming election next week. They also work, in the Middle East, working with Palestinians and Israelis and all sorts of folks on other sides of conflict, ethnic divides, religious divides, whatever have you. So we had a really interesting conversation just about, one, how the organization works to do that, and two, kind of why that is important. And he reframed the localization argument, I think, in a way that was interesting and different. What Shamil argues is that we shouldn't really be, we have to look at localization more critically than we are now in terms of not just having, okay, a community-based group, but who is making up that community-based group? And is that community-based group doing what it can to bring folks from different sides of perspectives together? Whether that be even, he gave the example of, I think it was a community foundation in Virginia, another state in the US, doing trash takeouts. And are they doing anything to pair Republicans and Democrats or folks from different racial groups or religious groups, et cetera? And he said, without that, we're at risk of, for example, repeating failures over and over again, or addressing more symptoms of conflict instead of the root causes of what really drive people apart. I think for me, as someone who covers American government and has the election looming next week in this country, it's something that was a refreshing and I think really important conversation to have, or at least to think about what we can do here and across the world to really tackle those root causes, which might just be division.
This is something that I found really interesting with localization. He's not the first person to mention this. I think we all agree that broadly this is the correct direction of travel, and this is just a couple of caveats that we should be kind of introducing to it. But when we localize services, there are often multiple factions within a country, different groups of whether they're ethnic groups or religious groups or whatever it is. If you go into a country and you set up a local organization, who's running that local organization? Who are they running it for? Are they running it for the whole community, for everybody in that area? Or are they running it only for people in their own area? I think Shamil gave the example of maybe there's a clinic and it gets burned down, and then you decide that you're going to build that clinic again. But if the clinic is only serving one of several ethnic groups in the area, what's going to happen is those other ethnic groups are going to come and they're going to burn the clinic down again. If you don't understand the division, if you don't understand those challenges, you risk kind of getting it wrong. And one of the things that there's been very little research actually into whether localization actually is a good thing. Everybody's kind of accepted it as an article of faith. And the little research that we have seen broadly says that it is, but it highlights definite areas where local people said they preferred international organizations. And the number one reason that they gave for preferring international organizations was that they were neutral. And they felt that they could be trusted because they were from outside the area. They didn't have any favorites. They were going to treat everybody just the same. And I think that's something that we haven't necessarily explored properly. I think it's really interesting.
Yeah, no, I think sorry, go ahead, Elissa.
No, I just think another piece of that too that Shamil brought up was how development organizations and humanitarian organizations kind of pursue aims to do good, but often with really exclusionary and sometimes adversarial tactics. So that might be, for example, let's take a Democratic group in the US who's really pushing forward and refusing to listen to what Republicans have to say or vice versa, or same thing, especially going on in the Middle East, groups unwilling to work with folks on the Israeli side or the Palestinian side, or unwilling to even hear what they have to say. And he just kind of pointed to that as a further erosion of a lot, and especially kind of the buildup of polarization that makes things ever harder to tackle. So he kind of, his takeaway message to the room of development professionals was really to think through whether your organizations are doing any of this, because you could have the best intentions, but if you're excluding particular groups, I think Shamil's question was, will you really get the job done that you want to get done?
Yeah. No, and to Dave's point, I think, we've been talking about narratives, is it's important to have this counter narrative to localization. I mean, I think it's interesting the point of that a lot of people view it as neutral entities, but there is, many people will say, or maybe not say out loud, there is a place for international INGOs. They are globally networked, they have skills. There is the case to be made that smaller local groups cannot necessarily absorb a ton of money, or if they can, they'll just become a big international INGO and just duplicate that kind of bureaucracy. So I think it's just really important to point out that there are both sides of an argument, and I think we've done that because we're journalists and we do a fabulous job. But yeah, I think it was really good that we had that range of speakers, and I go back to what you were saying, Dave, which again, in messaging the narrative, we had the other panel that really stuck out, the two panels for me, was Scott Nathan of the Development Finance Corps and John Ngengasong, the head of PEPFAR. They are both looking at reauthorizations by the US Congress. And I think, again, you don't want to think of an aid worker as a salesman, but the head of these large entities, they've got to put in a sales pitch to why they should be reauthorized, to why they should get more money. It's not an easy task, and it can't just be, we can't put HIV/AIDS in the rearview mirror because we'll undo 20 years of progress. That's absolutely true, but you have to be really politically savvy to talk to Congress and try and get money out of them. And I don't envy either Scott Nathan or John Ngengasong for what they're up against. It's this politically divisive environment. We've got an election coming up. It could completely tilt the balance of power, not just in the White House, but in Congress. And so again, it just kind of goes back that there has to be a message there that resonates. And I think that was just kind of a running, interesting theme throughout our event.
Especially, don't forget, this year, the world's largest development funds, I think the biggest 11, are raising almost or over $100 billion. They're trying to. So they're all trying to do this at the same time. So talk about sales pitch, right? $100 billion with everything going on in the world. So good luck.
It's an interesting challenge, isn't it? What you don't want to end up doing is saying this is the amount of development dollars out there and we're going to fight each other for it. And you have seen, unfortunately, non-profit fundraising with the public over the last 20 years has been exactly this. And INGOs have really run into this train wreck full speed, where the public has not given any more money to non-profits, to charities, than it did 20 years ago. But the amount of money that non-profits have spent trying to get hold of that has increased hugely. And so more and more cash has just been plowed into basically a fist fight over the same dollar. And I think we see the risk of the same thing happening right now in the development space. We've kind of defined this is the ODA pot. It's supposed to be 0.7. It's actually 0.4. And let's all now get into a fist fight over who actually gets it. We've got to make the case that there's a value to all of this, and that we should not be robbing Peter to pay Paul. I think that that's an extremely difficult journey to make, and I'm not sure that we've succeeded in doing it.
It is. Well, I don't want to necessarily end on a downbeat note, but it is challenging, and this is what we've been consistently covering, and we'll cover in the future. Probably even next week, because it is election day in the US on Tuesday, which I cannot process for the life of me. But at least it'll mean the end of political ads here. Or at least we'll see. So there's that silver lining, but we will be back next week to discuss the election, depending on what's happening, which we have no idea what is going to happen. We also just wanted to mention we've got some special episodes coming out that will drop in between our regular shows. We've got one featuring Africa 50, which will talk about bridging infrastructure financing gap across Africa. So that'll be an interesting one. We're going to have more podcasts related to the climate change conference in Azerbaijan. So stay tuned for those as well. And yeah, so basically we've got a lot more to talk about. Thank you, Elissa. Thank you, Dave, for joining today.
Thanks very much, Anna.
Thanks. And thanks everyone else. Take care.